You're watching TechShark, bite-sized news for conservatives surfing the net. Unlike other shows, we're not just complaining about big tech tyranny or media bias. We're talking about how the conservative movement is starting its own solutions and changing its game plan to take on big tech. Today, I'm joined by Conservative Partner Institute Senior Director of Policy and Free Speech America board member Rachel Bovard. She is the first guest to be interviewed twice here on TechShark because, quite frankly, she's the first expert I had in mind to ask questions on recent stories. Thanks for joining us on TechShark.
I'm so glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
So what reminded me I should catch up with you is your commentary on the Freedom Convoy of truckers protesting COVID-19 mandates. You mentioned how weaponizing the banking system over ideology is now becoming a pattern in the West. What does the debanking and financial blacklisting that happened in Canada foretell for Americans like us?
So I don't think a lot of people have necessarily been paying attention to the unbanking effort that's been going on here in the United States. It hasn't been occurring at the mass scale like you saw in Canada. And it, does require, if the federal government's going to freeze a bank account in the United States, there's a host of due process it has to go through because we have the Constitution. But you are seeing certain banks choose to not associate with certain groups of people. And this began with sort of these unsympathetic provocateurs like Alex Jones and Laura Loomer, who were cut off from certain aspects of commerce and the marketplace. And then you saw it famously with Donald Trump when he was not only kicked off Facebook and Twitter and all the social media platforms, but his banks refused to work with him. His credit cards refused to work with him. Stripe and Shopify wouldn't work with his campaign. And then you started to see banks, big institutional banks like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Citibank refused to process transactions for certain gun purchases, refused to provide depository services for any federal contractor that worked with ICE, down at the border. And then you're also now seeing sort of at a broader scale, the crowdfunding platforms refusing to work with certain causes. PayPal, which is the country's biggest non-bank lender. So if you don't want to go to the traditional banking route, you want to go through PayPal, which owns Venmo, which is a very popular cash swapping app, as now policing the ideology of its users. It brought in the Anti-Defamation League and a bunch of other groups they will not, disclose to say, oh no, this is hate speech. This person shouldn't be, using this platform. So it's a growing trend here in the United States, which I think really should be of concern because this isn't just the ability to, not be on Facebook or not be able to tweet. This is accessing the market. This is accessing the guts of capitalism. It is really hitting or striking at the taproot of the free market, which is the ability to make a living in this country. And that is of concern. I think should be of wider concern to Republican politicians, but the conservative base as well.
Absolutely. Part of what made the financial blacklisting and debanking of the convoy so terrifying to me is that they tried every legit route they could, and it fell like dominoes. Traditional bank accounts got frozen or refused business altogether. GoFundMe cut them off. Give, Send, Go, bless their hearts, got hacked. Then Canada went after like 34 crypto wallets. Will Canada's tyrannical shift impact Americans who donated to the truckers? How will conservatives finance dissent in the face of tyranny going forward?
Well, this is, I think, the big question because the right has always assumed, we have always assumed that the marketplace is somewhat values neutral, right? That companies will not cut off half their user base. It's not in their financial incentive to do so. Why would they do that? But they are. The reality is they have chosen in many cases ideology over, servicing half the country. Whether or not this works out for them financially, I don't know, but a lot of them are big enough to withstand, not servicing those customers. So this is something that we just haven't prepared for. And I think you are now seeing right-leaning institutions scramble to, again, build their own alternatives, right? My friends, Chris Bedford and Martina Villa have RightForge, which is a web hosting company just for conservative causes to avoid the Amazon Web Services deplatforming problem. But, it's almost at the point where we're going to have to build our own banks, apparently, right? The financial system is now being ideologically weaponized. And so I think you have two choices as a conservative. You can, try to work with people that, like you can build your own financial system in some respects, or, I think there's a political answer or a policy answer to this too, which is to sort of mandate some type of access to everyone to basic market services. I'm not talking about the social media companies here. I'm actually just talking about banking services. And I'm not sure the right is even prepared to do that. So in the interim, I think there are people scrambling to try and build their own services. But again, when you have email service weaponized against you, right? When you have banks that don't want to give you loans, when you can't even use the non-bank services, that is becoming harder and harder, which is why I think the spotlight needs to be on this problem, because we've always looked at the free market as an equalizer, right? The great equalizer of American society. But when it's used instead as an ideological cudgel and an enforcer, we have a problem.
Absolutely. One strange thing that I've been noticing is that some of the Scandinavian countries have been more willing to experiment with the whole COVID thing. Denmark, for example, recently released its restrictions and now has a government website pushing back against COVID fear-mongering in the media, calling it misinformation. Their neighbors in the rest of Scandinavia seem more relaxed than our country as well. Why is it that in what we thought were free countries descended from Britain, like US, Australia, Canada, they seem to be more PC totalitarian than socialist countries? Why is that?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, but I think one of the answers is that we are just much bigger, more diverse countries. And that was always the sort of founding promise of America, was this idea that totally opposite viewpoints and religious views and the ways of living could live together, that our self-government, our democracy, our pluralism was the appeal, that we could sustain all of this dissent because our Constitution was set up to do it. We had a marketplace where the clash and clang of ideas and approaches was celebrated and tolerated. And in diverse societies, that's always been a gamble. It's always been an experiment. And I think, people say it's hyperbolic to talk about it in these terms, but I do think the American experiment is under test. It is being stress tested in a very significant way because, again, as you point out, you do have these elements, right, that literally do not want to hear ideas they disagree with. They do not want people they disagree with to flourish in any capacity. And they are using market power and non-traditional, non-government avenues to suppress it. And America, as we've always understood it as a self-government, and I think you could say this about Canada, about Australia, again, about these big diverse populations, you can't have that in a free society the way they've been set up. And so I think it's a lot easier for homogenous societies, to sort of all row in one direction, where in America it was never going to be that. That was never what America was supposed to be. So I do think that the question for the right in a lot of these cases is, do we have to have a policy solution to protecting dissent, to protecting diversity of thought, to protecting, that critical component of America's way of life? Or is it something where we just have to, again, build our own institutions from the ground up? In which case, I would argue the end conclusion of that is not even America as we've understood it. It's literally two countries occupying one geographic location.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, case in point, Irish Twitter VP Sinead McSweeney warned of the United States launching unprecedented government crackdowns against free speech and requests for surveillance of internet users in the platform's latest transparency report back a few months ago. The Biden Department of Homeland Security warned that dis, and malinformation, perhaps including COVID-19 misinformation, could be a domestic terror threat. As I say often, the difference between tyranny and modern liberal democracy seems to be more about tone or style rather than policy. What do you think it would take for the average American voter to acknowledge that America has taken some scary steps towards becoming a totalitarian state, if not a bit more subtle without the military parades and such?
Well, I think this latest initiative from the Biden administration should wake a lot of people up, because if suddenly your emails or tweets expressing skepticism about COVID health policy are getting you in trouble, right? You are being labeled a domestic terrorist, which opens up a huge gamut of authorities for the federal government to use against you, in many cases circumventing traditional due process. That should terrify you. And again, this has been a slow burn, right? This has been the frog not realizing it's being boiled in the pot, right? This began, way back in 9/11 when the security state sort of rose up, and the sort of specter of domestic terrorism or international terrorism became this massive umbrella under which federal surveillance powers grew tremendously. But what concerns me even more is this sort of fusion between that element of the government and so much private industry that wants to use those levers of the government under this umbrella of domestic terrorism to punish people who disagree. That is an era that we have never trespassed into before, and one that really should concern us, because it's a situation where, okay, not only is the government mining your tweets for, wrongthink and punishing you thusly, then you try to get a bank loan and the bank is like, no, we've looked at your Twitter and it's against our terms of service because you think a certain way, so we won't give you a loan. That is creating an ideological caste system that, is enforced at the federal level, but also enforced in the private sector. And that, again, I come back to this feeling that a self-government cannot survive that. So for the right, this is a very precarious time. I really do think that.
Yeah, we really have this breaking point moment. I saw you comment on CIA spying without congressional oversight the other day, and I have to ask a really tough question. It seems the best conservatives can do these days often is we complain about government institutions or big tech, we point out double standards, or create studies about how much bad stuff they're doing, and we hope they change. It seems like the rules don't matter when they break them, at least. And the best conservatives often can do in the movement and entire organizations is point at the rule book saying you're not following the rules. Do institutions fear no consequence for overstepping at this point, or is there some action people and organizations have to take to fight back?
So I think we've moved far beyond the point of shaming, because that has always been the right's approach. Oh, if we just point this out enough, they'll be so shamed that they'll change their behavior. These people are shameless. They don't care that they're breaking the rules. The tech companies do not care that their hypocrisy is pointed to. They are proud of it. And this is, I talked to a lot of lawmakers on Capitol Hill about how to rein in big tech. And they're like, well, if we just have enough transparency. And it's like, no, they don't care. They are proud of the fact they banned Donald Trump. They are proud of the fact they disproportionately banned conservatives. So I do think we are in this phase where the self-government needs to respond. This is new and different for the right. We've always said the government, should sort of let things play out, let the market work, but the market isn't working right now. And so I do think it is incumbent upon our representatives in Congress to preserve access to the institutions that make up our society for people like us. That is a basic element of representative government. The government, we'd like to see it smaller, but it does exist for a specific reason, and that is to defend the rights of its citizens. And, against the type of tyranny that we're witnessing now, against the type of this corporate state fusion over ideological causes. So I do think it's time for conservatives to step up with actual policy solutions, because in many cases, what's happening in the market is empowered by an overstepping federal government. So this is well within our wheelhouse. We've moved past the point of pointing it out, complaining, hoping that shaming the companies is enough. It's not working. So we need action now.
Absolutely. I definitely hear you on that. We've certainly got our work cut out for us. So, all right, we're out of time. But hey, it's been great talking to you once again. And I look forward to seeing where the Conservative Partnership Institute leads the conservative movement in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
You've been watching TechShark. Once again, I'm Alexander Hall with MRC-TV and Free Speech America. Have a good week.